Biddy Mason was a Los Angeles nurse, real estate investor, and philanthropist. She was born into slavery in Georgia. Later, she was enslaved by Robert and Rebecca Dorn Smith in Mississippi. Rebecca Smith then inherited Hannah Smiley and her children. In 1848, the Smiths took Biddy and Hannah and their children to the Salt Lake Valley. After a few years, the Smiths took the two women and their children to California and kept them in illegal bondage there. By the start of the Civil War, almost 4 million people were held in racialized slavery in the United States. Only a few hundred of them, including Biddy and Hannah, lived in the West. By 1856, the Smiths decided to leave California for Texas. Hannah and Biddy didn't want to go, so their friends sent word to a judge in Los Angeles. The judge declared the two women and their families free under California law. Biddy worked as a nurse and midwife and became a wealthy Los Angeles landowner. Hannah lived in San Bernardino. Some of her descendants became well-known musicians. Most of the documents in this presentation are from Biddy Mason and Hannah Smiley Embers, or from people they knew. My name is Amy Tanner Theriot. I'm finishing a book about the experiences of the enslaved black pioneers of Utah Territory, including Biddy and Hannah. Many people don't know that slavery was legal in Utah before the Civil War. More than 100 African American men, women, and children lived in bondage there. During the 8 years I've researched the names and experiences, I've learned repeatedly that many genealogists know little about slavery. Most of the family histories that mention the subject make major mistakes. It's always important to understand the history and laws behind genealogical records, but it's especially important when slavery is involved. My presentation will address some of the most common mistakes. It will, however, be very general. There's just enough time to touch on a few important points. See the syllabus for additional resources, including research tips. It's great to meet in this online conference. Before starting the presentation, I'd like to mention the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, especially the New Jersey, New York, and Utah chapters. Also Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage and other genealogical organizations, as well as Scholars of Slavery and African American Genealogy. This is complex and emotional work, but it's vital for our families and nation. Although this Roots Tech presentation will be PG rated, there's nothing PG rated about slavery. It was an institution that only survived with government-approved violence, the constant threat of violence, and various forms of abuse. The legal structure of slavery makes records-based genealogy difficult and sometimes impossible, but there are growing numbers of resources about slavery and African American genealogy. The system of racialized hereditary slavery created a politically powerless workforce. It denied enslaved people basic human rights. Since the government did not grant them legal rights, when the enslaved appeared in documents, they were often listed without names. You'll see this in the 1850 and 1860 censuses, although as you'll see later, Biddy and Hannah did appear by name in the 1850 census slave schedule. The legal structure of slavery meant that when records do list names, they often list only given names. It is not until after they were freed that records show Hannah and Biddy with their family names. Slavery caused the ongoing breakup of families. Biddy and Hannah had little control of their family life during slavery. American slavery is an unfamiliar system. Our country still feels its impact in many ways, but we've forgotten many of its practices and laws. This means, as I've seen again and again, that much of what many people think they know about slavery is not true. But due to the growing number of resources, we can educate ourselves about the system and its documents and do accurate work. Again, this is a brief and general presentation. It is for those who encounter slavery while doing genealogy, whether you're a descendant of the enslaved or enslavers or working in community records. Where will we encounter slavery while working in U.S. records? It may be easier to ask where we won't find records. Most slavery was concentrated in the southern states, but it reached from north to south, coast to coast. This is the kind of record and place we might typically think about when we think of slavery. This tax record from Mississippi probably shows Biddy and her children in the Smith household. They are shown only as numbers. Rhode Island might not be the first state that comes to mind when we think of slavery, but Rhode Island played an important role in the transatlantic slave trade. This is a Rhode Island will that left enslaved Quam and Chloe to the testator's children. Biddy Mason and Hannah Smiley didn't know Quam and Chloe, but they knew the great-grandson of the author of this will when they all lived in San Bernardino, California. Hannah and Biddy's enslavers took them to California after it became a free state, and the Smiths kept them in illegal bondage through 1856. This is the 1852 state census that shows the two women and their families. The state census also shows some of Biddy and Hannah's acquaintances. You can see that the census taker listed slave as their occupation. In this case, Their enslaver took them to California before it became a state, so state law allowed him to enslave Amy, John, Sandy, Jim, Lucinda, and Jordan through 1865. So be prepared to see evidence of slavery anywhere you research in the United States. Here's a very quick review of the history of slavery in the U.S. Slavery was present in North America long before 1619, but 1619 helps mark the beginning of the system of racialized American slavery. I'll mention partus later, but the beginnings of the laws of American slavery date back to the 17th century. The United States was founded on ideals of equality, but the national constitution allowed slavery. In 1807, Congress ended the importation of slaves. The law didn't entirely stop the slave trade, but it slowed it. This means that the African ancestors of most African American families were in the United States before 1808. At the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment ended legalized hereditary slavery. Language changes. Language used in the past may not be acceptable anymore. These brief notes may be helpful, mostly for descendants of enslavers. Besides these notes, you will want to consult other authorities for proper usage. Historians and genealogists currently use the terms Black or African American. If you're going through historical documents, you'll see older terms plus derogatory terms. As genealogists, if we're directly quoting documents, we leave the language as is, but don't use dated or offensive language otherwise in our work. During slavery, people used words like master and mistress and also the term servant to mean an enslaved person. These words try to disguise slavery in gentility. There's nothing genteel about human trafficking, forced labor, and all the abuses that accompanied the system. You might occasionally run across the Irish slave myth as well. See the syllabus for resources about the myth. In the interest of historical accuracy, we call slavery what it was. Historical writing now uses the terms enslaved and enslaver. We acknowledge Biddy Mason's humanity by recognizing her first as a person, so instead of calling her the slave, we say, Biddy was enslaved. She was a mother, a midwife, a real estate investor, a philanthropist, and a community builder. Finally, a plantation was an agricultural economic unit with 20 or more enslaved workers. Smaller agricultural units were farms. I've seen many descendants call their ancestors plantation owners when they were really farmers with enslaved workers. And now to the laws and documents of slavery. In the 17th century, Virginia adopted a Roman practice called partus sequitur ventrum. If a mother was enslaved, so were her children, and they belonged from birth to her enslaver. Enslavers used the system to build wealth and labor capacity. This shows a clip from the 1856 writ of habeas corpus that freed Hannah and Biddy. Biddy had 3 or more children, and Hannah eventually may have had 9 or more. It didn't matter to the legal system who the fathers of their children were, or whether the fathers were enslaved or free. Under the laws of slavery, all these children belonged to Robert and Rebecca Smith. Most of the law that governed the day-to-day existence of the enslaved was state law. For details, you can consult the books Southern Slavery and the Law and The Law of Freedom and Bondage. These works and others are listed in the syllabus. When you encounter legal documents, remember that the language was standard. If you Google phrases from the document, you may find similar documents online, sometimes with explanations about their meaning. The law considered enslaved people as property. The law usually classed the enslaved as personal property or chattel. Enslavers paid tax on their taxable slaves. This means you may find information about the enslaved in both property and tax records. To define enslaved people as property, enslavers had to tie themselves in legal, ethical, and religious knots, as you'll learn when you read histories of slavery. The enslaved had little sympathy for these rationalizations, as we'll learn from their ongoing efforts to resist the system and liberate themselves. Property means wealth. Family stories told by descendants of enslavers often ignore or hide this part of the history, but you'll see over and over as you encounter the legal records of slavery that enslavers considered the enslaved as wealth, security, labor capacity, and inheritance. This meant, unfortunately, the ongoing breakup of enslaved families. Hannah's daughter, Anne, told the California judge who freed her family, "I cannot say now whether to stay or go. I want to stay where my mother stays. It is hard to be scattered so." Along with estate documents, the census is the record of slavery genealogists may encounter most. This is the 1830 census showing Hannah as a girl in the Dorn household in Edgefield County, South Carolina. The 1850 and 1860 censuses had separate slave schedules. Hannah and Biddy appear here in an unusual one. The census forms got lost on their way across the country to Utah Territory, so finally, in the spring of 1851, territorial officials created their own forms. The census takers made a mistake and recorded the names of the enslaved. having these names is a historical treasure. On the right is the official slave schedule. Hannah went by the name Smiley after she was freed, so she may have had a connection to the Smiley families of South Carolina. Estate documents are an important place to find the names of the enslaved. Even so, existing records contain only a fraction of the names of the people enslaved in the U.S. This is why DNA projects can be so important. You will occasionally find estate documents for women or ethnic minorities, but most often for white, middle, or upper-class males. The names of the enslaved might appear during this process in wills, in an estate inventory, or in other court documents. Biddy Mason's daughter reported that she was from Hancock County, Georgia. Not long before she showed up in Mississippi, Thomas Mason died in Hancock County. This is an inventory of his estate. After almost a decade of working in these records, it is still shocking to see the enslaved listed with other property. Despite the connection between the place and name, I haven't been able to definitively connect Biddy Mason to this estate. The document lists Barbara and 2 children. Was Biddy Barbara? Was she one of the 2 children? The birth dates provided for her in various records vary so widely that either could be the case. Thomas Mason's estate inventory showed Anthony valued at $650, Peter at $600, and Barbara and 2 children at $1,300. It is grim to see these values placed on human lives and think of the suffering hidden in those numbers. How did the appraisers arrive at these values? It had to do with factors such as age, sex, health, reproductive capacity, labor capacity, and local and national markets. For more details, read Economic Histories of Slavery and see the website Measuring Worth. Green Flake and Elizabeth Flake Rowan were friends of Hannah Smiley and Biddy Mason. They were probably brother and sister. The North Carolina will of Jordan Flake probably separated these 2 from their parents. Legal guides can help explain the details of estates that will help us trace enslaved families. Sometimes enslavers needed cash more than labor, so they hired out the enslaved. It was a common practice. In a diary, a neighbor mentioned hiring either Biddy or Hannah as a nurse or midwife. He wrote woman, not a name, so we don't know which one. These newspaper ads show the hiring of enslaved women and a teenage boy. Manumission was the freeing or emancipation of the enslaved. Manumission was rare. It's not uncommon, however, to find descendants of enslavers falsely claiming that their ancestors freed their slaves. States were afraid of rebellion by the enslaved and did not like having free black populations, so over time they increasingly limited manumission. George Washington freed the people he enslaved in his will. That was uncommon, and that method of manumission became increasingly impossible in much of the South. If there is a legal manumission, depending on the state, it will normally be in the records of a county courthouse or state legislature. I have a book in my collection, not too old, that repeats the myth that the enslaved did not have family names. Enslaved people did have family names even though legal documents rarely showed them. There is not one set of rules about how names worked, but from what I've seen and when there was any stability in their lives, children tended to take their father's family name and wives took their husband's family name. Sometimes family names coincide with the last enslaver's name. Often they do not. Biddy and Hannah did not use the name Smith, although occasionally Hannah's children did. After Hannah was freed, she married Toby Embers. He came from the Crosby household. When the enslaved in this household were freed, they used a variety of names, but never Crosby. The names they used may tell you something about the conditions in the household and provide clues about their origins and relationships. These are cohabitation or freedmen's marriage records. After slavery ended, formerly enslaved people could register their marriages with the government. Southern states or counties may have collections. To the left, you see the record of the marriage of Turner Williams and Esther Aycock. They had been married for 30 years, but it was not until 1866 that the government recognized their marriage. To the right, Catawba County, North Carolina, continued the traditions of slavery and only recorded given names. The database Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery, collects notices placed in newspapers of people seeking their families. Although their family names wouldn't have appeared in the legal records, they do appear in these notices. In the notice to the top left, for example, a man states, "My name is John Dennis and has never been changed." Whether we encounter slavery as the descendant of enslavers, or the enslaved, or both, or discover records while working through the history of a community, we can consult histories of slavery and guides to African American genealogy to help understand what we're seeing and do accurate work. Remember to download the syllabus for additional resources. Thank you for remembering Hannah Smiley Embers and Biddy Mason and their families and friends and reviewing the laws of slavery today.